Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about the presidency of our second U.S. president and the first to live in what we now call the White House, what you see there, John Adams. Adams dealt with a lot of stuff during his presidency that was holdover from Washington's administration. Foreign policy, conflict with France and England, for instance, the political party struggles between Hamilton, Jefferson, the Federalists and the Republicans that had sort of started earlier in the 1790s. So if you're one of my students and you watch the video on Washington, there's going to be quite a bit of overlap between that video and this one. But with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. In March of 1797, when John Adams was sworn into office as the second president, he was approached by George Washington after the ceremony, and Washington told him, "Well, I'm out and you're in, and let's see who will be happier." And that ended up being very telling because John Adams, for the most part, had a fairly miserable presidency. He inherited a lot of the problems that Washington had had to deal with, namely the fallout from the war between England and France, in which America had declared neutrality, which just made basically everyone angry. France was incredibly angry with the United States as a result of Jay's Treaty, because Jay's Treaty, as you'll recall, sort of patches things up between the U.S. and England and gives England most favored nation status with regards to trade, which France is angered by, and they sort of see that as a backstab by the Americans, whom they had helped during the American Revolution. So that conflict is going to be the backdrop for a lot of the issues that Adams will have to deal with, either directly or indirectly. In an attempt to smooth things over with the French in 1797, Adams sent 3 U.S. Diplomats over to Paris to negotiate a new treaty of alliance with the French. The intent was for those 3 men to meet with Charles Talleyrand, who was the French foreign minister in the revolutionary government. The French government in charge at this time was the Directory, which was the government in charge immediately before Napoleon comes to power. Anyway, instead of meeting with Talleyrand, they are met by a series of lower-level French diplomats over a handful of days, and it becomes very apparent that the French are demanding an exorbitant bribe in order to even meet with Talleyrand. No guarantee of any kind of alliance or concessions, anything like that. Just to get into a room with Talleyrand, the Americans were going to have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars. Word of this eventually gets back to the United States. Of course, it takes some time because things had to go by boat at the time. And in the official correspondence with the government about this incident, the names of the 3 diplomats were redacted and replaced by the letters X, Y, and Z, probably just for clarity. And so you didn't have to, I guess, worry about French names, maybe. I don't know. But as a result of that, this becomes known as the XYZ affair. And Americans were outraged, especially the Federalists, who have never been big fans of the French. You'll recall that the Federalists favor a more pro-British foreign policy. And so they say the French have insulted us, we can't trust them. And even the Republicans, who were typically in favor of France, didn't really have a very effective counter-argument for this. And it looked like America was headed headlong into a war with France over this insult and this refusal to negotiate diplomatically. Adams resisted this, though. Adams did, when this first broke out, call for raising an army, and he called for some ships to be built for a navy, just in case. But Adams realized that the Americans were very, very ill prepared for a war with France at this point. What did end up happening between 1798 and 1800 was what's called the Quasi-War, which is an undeclared, basically pirate war between the French and the U.S. that was primarily fought down in the Caribbean, which consisted of both countries just constantly harassing the other country's shipping over the course of a couple of years. And in 1800, that finally comes to an end with the Convention of 1800, also known as the Treaty of Mortefontaine, which marks the official breakup between the French and the Americans after they had formed their alliance during the American Revolution. But the fact that Adams kept the country out of war, while it was fortunate for the country in retrospect, did anger the Federalists, who were really, really pushing for it. And they were able to use this anti-French sentiment for their own political gain later on. In the wake of what had happened during the XYZ affair and the Quasi War, the Federalists were able to sort of exploit anger against the French and anger against the pro-French Republicans to gain a stronger foothold on the government in the 1798 congressional midterm elections. Once they got more power, they moved to weaken the Republicans even further. And so they passed a series of acts that were designed to do that. The Alien Act was one. The Alien Act said the government could deport or detain aliens during a time of war, or if they were deemed to be dangerous, and it wasn't really specified how you would determine if an alien, someone from another country, was dangerous. So it's kind of shady. The Naturalization Act is a purely political measure. This says that if you were an immigrant into the United States, you had to be a resident for 14 years before you could become a citizen. It had been 5 years prior to this, and of course the big change there is if you're not a citizen, you can't vote. And immigrants who were not as wealthy and not as powerful in the country tended to favor the Republicans. The Republicans were more in favor of like an agrarian economy. They're primarily based in the South, whereas the wealthy financiers of the North are going to tend towards being Federalists. So immediately there are accusations, of course, that the Federalists are doing this to try to keep Republican sympathetic people from voting for Republicans. You also have the Sedition Act passed in 1798, which says that newspaper editors could be fined or thrown in jail if they criticized the president or Congress. And of course, Republicans were just all a Twitter about this, and they claimed that it violated the First Amendment. Remember, this is before Marbury versus Madison. That's not until 1803. So the Supreme Court doesn't really have the power of judicial review. So these acts stood, and while they weren't widely used, it did, serve to make the partisan divide between the Federalists and the Republicans even worse, and it led to the philosophy of nullification. As I said before, the Republicans were completely a Twitter about the Alien and Sedition Acts, and began saying, look, y'all, this is exactly what we were talking about when we were trying to fight the ratification of the new Constitution. We told you that a government that was too strong could become like a monarch and begin squashing legitimate political dissent. And they began to argue that the states weren't necessarily unified under one all-powerful federal government, but rather the states were in a compact or an agreement with the national government, and that states could nullify that compact if their rights were being violated. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison articulated this policy in resolutions that they wrote that were adopted by Kentucky and Virginia, respectively, and these become known as the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, and it introduces this doctrine of nullification, the idea that states can nullify federal laws. And even though this didn't happen in this case, the Republicans would come to power in the 1800 election, and all of these laws, the Alien Act, the Sedition Act, the Naturalization Act, they were just sort of allowed to fizzle out, and they weren't renewed, and they were thrown in the dust heap of history. But their philosophies do play a role later on in the nullification crisis in South Carolina in the 1830s, and then again, of course, during the Civil War. So politically, based on what we've already talked about, you can probably see where this is headed. The Federalists had grossly overplayed their hand during Adams' presidency and took a lot of unpopular actions that led to them losing a lot of their support. And the Republicans very easily win the election of 1800 with Thomas Jefferson at the top of the ticket. And they also take control of Congress. And as you can see on the map there, New England, where the Federalist base had always been, for the most part remains true and votes for Adams, whereas most of the rest of the country supports the Republicans. A bit of a peculiarity in the 1800 election. Thomas Jefferson was the intended presidential candidate. His running mate was Aaron Burr. The way it worked before the 12th Amendment, there was not a separate ballot for president and vice president. So even all the presidents and the running mates are thrown onto one electoral college ballot. And so the electors, when they casted their ballots for Jefferson and for Burr, ended up creating a tie in the electoral college between the two. And even though Jefferson was the intended presidential candidate and Burr had made no mention of trying to become president because of this election, Burr did not concede or back down. And so the election had to go to the House of Representatives and went through dozens of ballots before finally in the House of Representatives, Jefferson prevailed. Ironically, Jefferson prevailed because of Alexander Hamilton, who, realizing that this deadlock was just going to go on forever if they didn't step in and do something, Hamilton convinced his supporters in Congress to vote for Jefferson because he saw Burr as being unstable and more radical and dangerous than Jefferson was. And events 4 years later in Weehawken, New Jersey would prove Alexander Hamilton absolutely correct. But the most important thing about the election of 1800 is that it shows that a peaceful transfer of power can take place, that power can move from one party to the other, from one man to another, and the wheels just keep on turning. And there's no rebellion, there's no government in exile. Adams doesn't try to create some puppet state up in Massachusetts or anything like that. He leaves office, Jefferson comes in, and that's that. And at the time, that was a pretty rare thing. And in some parts of the world, it is still a rare thing. That will do it for today. Make sure you are reading in your book if you're one of my students in preparation for the test. And as always, feel free to ask if you have any questions. Cheers.